interested in the core protocols, huh?
Yeah, well, just learning everything I can. I've been sitting in on some of the Casper sessions that are in collab, so getting a foundation there. And just like anything, it's just getting familiar with the terminology, and then the concepts behind them, and slowly building up that knowledge base. So I, I'm getting there. So this is all good.
Cool. Well, maybe you could be my guinea pig. I'm in the process of trying to put together an explanation of an approach to constraining the communications in such a way that we can ensure the termination of the protocol. So the protocol can't terminate um, with the unless you make assumptions about um, unless you make assumptions about synchrony constraints.
Hmm.
So yeah, so in particular, there's a result called FLP impossibility that says if you make some assumptions about asynchrony, so if everybody's free to kind of go off and do their own thing, there's no sort of bounds on time or time to deliver a message or other kinds of things
Hmm.
like that, then they can't converge. It's well known that you can't get agreement. Uh,
Mm.
so you have to make some kinds of agreements about or some kinds of assumptions about synchrony. And what if you try to impose those synchrony assumptions using wall clock time, then you introduce something that you introduce more reliance on some kind of time service. So you've introduced something you have to trust,
Hmm.
uh, and time service is really hard to get right. Network time is exceptionally hard to get right,
Mm.
just in its own right. But on top
Okay.
of that, um, there's another issue, and that issue is you actually have to start worrying about relativistic effects. Time is more bendy and stretchy than we think it is. Like,
Okay.
um, and in particular, this shows up between satellite devices or satellite-based communications and the ground,
Hmm.
because they're moving at speeds relative to ground speeds that actually introduce relativistic effects. So you have to do error correction on the basis of the kind of bendiness and
Mm.
stretchiness of time when you
Hmm.
introduce those kinds of distances and speeds.
Okay.
So all of that says that introducing synchrony constraints using wall clock time is very challenging, very
Hmm.
difficult. And if we could introduce synchrony constraints without having to appeal to wall clock time, then that would be advantageous for the protocol.
Okay.
So, in other words, there's at least potentially we don't have to trust as much. So that's kind of the idea. And
Hmm.
so the question is, how do you introduce synchrony constraints without wall clock time? How do you get
Okay.
people to agree on a notion of time? And the basic idea is that um, um, they can agree on message arrival order um, up to uh, up to some considerations. So, and this is because one of the things that we're doing is we're providing we're providing uh, message structure that keeps message history. Um,
Okay.
yeah, so each message that every protocol participant sends um, comes with what's called a justification pointer. And
Mm-hmm.
that justification pointer describes the history of the message. So one way to think about it is really kind of on a pedestrian point of view. You can imagine that you've got a um, like in a client and server kind of situation. There's not a lot of justification needed for an arbitrary client to contact the Amazon server, right?
Mm-hmm.
They want sort of unjustified communication, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of their raison d'être. Um, Now, if the Amazon server needs to go back to the client to collect more information before serving a request, that request from the server to the client is justified by the client's initial request. So in the message that goes from the server to the client, you would include the client's original request to say, well, I'm asking you this question because you asked me this other question.
Mm-hmm.
And you could
Okay.
kind of extend that idea and you could say, well, the client could turn around and so let's say that the client was asking to about um, some aspects of a particular purchase. Then the server might turn around and say, well, we'll send you that, but to what email address should we send it? And then but we need to send it to an email address, so please provide an email address. And then the client could turn around and say, well, do you want my work address or my home address, or
Mm-hmm.
my buyers club address, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the client's request to the server would now be justified by the server's request to the client, which was justified by the client's request to the server, right?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
You're following the
Yeah.
there.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea of justification pointers goes all the way back to Highland Abramsky Ong games. These were it's a different approach to game theory that uh, was used to solve a particular programming semantics problem. Um, and it can be used to detect, for example, single-threadedness, right? So that there's like in the example we just gave, you could see how there's just one thread or topic of conversation,
Mm-hmm.
right? But that
Mm-hmm.
isn't always the case. Like consider um, the following kind of common online interaction. So someone who wants to take a loan out, right, to
Mm-hmm.
buy a house. That loan is uh, uh, a quick a quick response on a loan typically involves a credit check on the loan applicant part, and a title check. Like, is
Mm-hmm.
this a real property? And is this person a good risk? Those are the two basic questions. And those are largely independent, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you could fire off both of those. And then the loan officer who's handling the request could, save some time because they're both running in parallel. And
Mm-hmm.
so the loan officer could get those requests and then look over the data from both of them, and then make a quick decision about whether or not this is a good credit risk.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's the basic idea.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those kinds of concurrency behaviors are safe, but other ones are not as safe. So in particular, you could imagine that the loan officer is not necessarily a trustworthy party, and they do a credit check, but not for the individual that is asking for the loan,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or they do a title check, but not for the property that's being requested,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so either of those things could result in an erroneous decision on the, like if the whole thing were automated, right? If
Mm-hmm.
either of those pieces of data were somehow diddled or changed, then the result on the applicant's request might not come back with the kind of fidelity that they wanted or the result that they wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And this is certainly the case in the kind of protocols that Casper is considering, because a validator could be incentivized to to spend to run transactions in a funny way, so that they could potentially double spend, right?
Mm-hmm.
They could transmit more coins than are available in this system in order to gain benefit for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the kind of thing we want to prevent.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that you can do is, with these justification pointers, you can detect equivocation. So
Mm-hmm.
you can detect certain kinds of lying
Mm-hmm.
that can happen with justification pointers. So and with enough gossip in the network, then these kinds of events can be detected, and the
Mm-hmm.
participants in the protocol can respond by they can respond by punishing the participant that lies in this way.
Right.
Um,
Okay.
so this is the basic idea,
Mm-hmm.
and it sort of gives you enough background to say, okay, so there's more information in the message structure, and that message contains a notion of history, and that notion of history could be used to establish some kind of time, even though it isn't wall clock time,
Okay.
right?
Mm-hmm.
It gives you relative orders of events, and
Right.
then
Right.
and then you still have to be a little bit more careful about you have to be a little bit more careful about because not everyone will have the same view of the relative orders of events.
Mm-hmm.
There can be, so as you have to, there's some subtlety here, but now what you want to do is, using information about the relative orders of events, can you can you um, can you detect enough um, uh, or can we introduce enough constraints on the relative orders of events that we can enforce the protocol to terminate?
Okay.
Yeah, and then it turns out that um, there are some proofs that uh, if the ways in which the messages differ can be successfully um, represented. How do I say this? If we think of the messages as being communicated over a potentially bad channel, so the channel can lose messages, or the messages can be lost,
Mm-hmm.
and um, uh, and some of the noisiness of the channel comes from the behavior of the validators themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So they can lie, or they
Mm-hmm.
can crash, or they can do other kinds of erroneous things which are difficult to distinguish from malevolence.
Mm-hmm.
Um, then there are so that basically what that does is that introduces noise into the
Mm-hmm.
communication channel.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you restrict the messages to those that can be um, corrected, or that can be successfully transmitted by introducing some redundancy into the message structure, so
Mm-hmm.
that think about it. if we eliminate all of our worries and concerns about malevolence,
Mm-hmm.
just worry about loss of information. If we were just sending over a single bit, right,
Mm-hmm.
we might get that bit across if instead of for every one bit we sent 3 bits. So
Mm-hmm.
if we're sending a 0, we send 000. If we're sending a 1, we send 111. And now if a recipient receives 001, right,
Mm-hmm.
then you kind of it's very very similar to the Casper idea, um, uh, which is you kind of take a democratic vote, right? There's two
Mm-hmm.
zeros and a one, so it's a 0. Or
Mm-hmm.
if you receive a 101, it's 2 ones and a 0, and so it's a 1.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some potential that it was erroneous, right? But that's so there, it turns out that there are a class of um, errors that we can handle by this kind of redundancy, and there's more to it than just redundancy. It turns out to be a fairly sophisticated number of techniques that we can employ
Mm-hmm.
in order to transmit a message in a lossy environment. Now,
Okay.
yeah. So then it turns out that if your messages are all related by an error correcting code, if they all stay inside the bounds of an
Mm-hmm.
error correcting code, then your agreement protocol can terminate.
Okay.
Basically the result is you can use error correcting codes as a way to impose synchrony constraints. So a way to force there to be a kind of time without using wall clock time.
Okay. So is the code sophisticated enough to be able to filter out the noise that is potentially in the channel?
That's the idea.
Okay.
Another way of looking at it is to say that the protocol is terminating basically only when we can sit inside, when the amount of noise is defeatable by
Okay.
the codes, and
Gotcha.
otherwise
Mm-hmm.
there's too much there's too much asynchrony to ensure that the protocol terminates.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So
Got it.
that's another way of thinking about this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
There's all kinds of really cool connections. So, for example, when I stumbled upon this idea, I was thinking about it in terms of another approach that's been employed for these kinds of things, although typically for negative results.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a topological approach. So essentially, what you're looking for is holes in the space of all paths the message could take.
Mm-hmm.
And if there are too many holes, then you can't come to agreement. So you have
Okay.
to kind of limit the number of holes. And it turn so any either of these basic approaches come down to providing a constraint language for termination that that sort of allows you to speak about what synchrony you must admit without having to admit a common wall clock.
Mm-hmm.
That's the core thing we're trying to solve.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
What I was able to follow along, given that I'm relatively fresh to all this, so I think you explained it in a very understandable way. So that was great. Thank you.
No, well, thank you for your patience and allowing me to explain it. It's very helpful. Like, people like Kent and Jim, they've been in this for decades or at least years,
Yeah,
and so we get rather deep and forget what other people don't know. So it's always helpful to have fresh eyes or fresh
sure.
ears.
Yeah,
Uh, yeah.
It makes perfect sense. I mean, basic fault tolerance. You have three systems, the two that agree, you go with. Um, uh, but the idea of, well, I won't go there. I'm thinking how quantum error correction applies. I
Oh yeah,
also
yeah. There's a
love
deep connection. There's a deep connection. And so the topological insights really show up here. In particular, you can use quantum error correction codes to build anti-de Sitter space. So in a lot of sort of standard model proposals, we live in what's called a de Sitter space. So it's a particular kind of space that is a solution to the Einstein field equations. And then and then the anti-de Sitter space is kind of like a dual to that in a certain way. And you can use the quantum error correcting codes to build up a notion of space-time, right? So if you think about it, right, what are the error correcting codes doing for us? They're building a notion of time for us, right? That's what they're doing. They're allowing us to build a wall clock time. And so the same thing actually happens in physics. You can use quantum error correcting codes to build up a notion of space-time. And the kind of space-time that people have successfully been able to build is anti-de Sitter space, or which is dual to the kind of space we normally live in. So there's a close connection there, Jim, and I'm getting more and more interested in it.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
No, and I love the idea of the justifications at the level of the social ledger.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought.
Social ledger to our chain, and I can see that layer of justifications being very powerful and very sort of real time. Is what we're doing here makes sense.
Kent, I think you're here to give us an update on your constant time protocol variation.
Well, I'm here to. Well, I guess I'm here. I'm here, but yeah. Well, I wanted to first cover I guess what I discovered with the invalid parents bug, if that's okay with you.
Okay, yeah. Well, give us general updates. For some reason, I thought you had a specific update you wanted to talk over today. But yeah, give us all your updates.
So I guess over the past 2 weeks, should I say, it started out that we got this invalid parents bug, and what that error message means is that among the justifications, every block picks a parent or multiple parents, and if when a validator receives a block with or just receives the block and tries to recompute the parent based on the justifications, it should arrive at the same conclusion, or like it should compute to the same parent, but it wasn't, and that was the issue. So the
But why wasn't it? Like, why didn't they arrive at the same conclusion?
yeah, so the issue 2 weeks ago was that, well, for calculating the estimator, we passed in the last finalized block, and we can do this because it's, if we have a finalized block, then we know that there isn't going to be a case in which a validator or at least the thought was, because it's the finalized block, there's no way that the parent will come in below that block, as in closer to genesis or further back in time. And at first the issue was simply just that, we thought, if we have multiple parents, it's possible that the main parent, or we thought that the main parent will always be above the last finalized block. But it could be possible that the secondary parents could come in below the last finalized block. And that would be the issue. And so we fixed that. We temporarily disabled having multiple parents, and so the issue should have been fixed. And we were going to think about the constant time estimator, or just some other solution, once we did this quick fix. But we discovered last week that the quick fix wasn't working for some reason, and we were really puzzled because the last, like, everything should come up above or every parent should come up above the last finalized block. But we realized that the last finalized block doesn't actually say where the parents can come in. It's possible for even the main parent to come in below the last finalized block. And that's because, so a simple example is, let's say you have 100 validators, and 99 of them are doing this round robin, and they're building up a long chain. All 99 are participating, and then they build up 1,000,000 blocks worth. But one validator decides to stay behind at genesis. And so the last finalized block, assuming they're all equally weighted, it should go up with the round robin, because the weight of that last validator shouldn't affect whether a block gets finalized or not. If your threshold is something, I guess, not 0.99. If you put your threshold that high, then, well, yeah, it would stay at the genesis. But assuming, let's say your threshold was 0.5, then you should be able to push up your last finalized block. But if the last validator decides to create a new block just after 1,000,000 blocks have passed, and that validator points to the genesis as the parent, that's an example, or that's the counterexample, where you can get a parent that is below your current last finalized block. And so another way to look at this is, it's not that there's only one last finalized block. There are actually there is a last finalized block for every validator. And the or another way to put it is the true last finalized block is the last finalized block among all the validators that's furthest back in the past. So in this case, it would be the genesis because there's one validator that's still left behind in the past. And yeah, so that's the bug. So the fix really is you actually just don't use, or this is one fix that I thought of. Although this was just a couple, or like yesterday. But you don't use the last finalized block to start your estimator, but you use the greatest common ancestor among the latest messages, and that essentially can come either above or below the last finalized block, and it changes a lot, or it changes as latest messages swap around, both upwards and downwards. But it works.
I see. Does it give us the same safety for the estimator?
It gives us the same estimator, if that is what you're asking.
Okay, I think I understand.
Yeah, so it's been quite a journey, but so yeah, like so back to the constant time estimator. So like what the constant time estimator would do is essentially it would allow us to sort of forget all these problems, in the sense that the constant time estimator will end up somehow knowing about the greatest common ancestor. At least whatever algorithm the constant time estimator ends up being, it somehow needs to know what the greatest common ancestor is. And there's no way, in my opinion, or I guess I'm pretty convinced that there's no way to construct it without somehow recording that in either one of the latest messages or sort of together with the DAG. And so, I mean, is that, I guess, good so far? Before.
So what you're doing is you're adding information to each message that ultimately gets baked into the DAG as blocks become finalized. That has to do with a total quantity of stuff. In this case, it's flow. It could be anything, but essentially you're taking a measure of something that's. I'm trying to find the right generic language here.
Are you trying to describe the constant time estimator, or are you trying to describe?
I'm trying to reflect back to you what you've said, but in a way that.
So you're talking about the invalid parents bug.
I'm talking about the constant time estimator.
Oh, but I haven't described that yet. If that makes sense.
Okay, all right, then keep. Then I know too much.
Okay, yeah. Oh yeah, I mean, I did an attempt 2 weeks ago. Yeah, but yeah, like I found a counterexample for that one, and so.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
That's good.
Yep. So yeah, and then yeah, so I mean, I went through like 3 iterations. So this is like my 4th attempt. So there's a good chance that it doesn't work also. But I guess I feel much better about this attempt, though. Just I don't know. I've been feeling better about each attempt. But anyways, So I guess the first thing that, after sort of going through all these, I guess, counter examples that failed on the other ones and trying to figure out like what was, I guess, what was the issue with all the past ones. It basically boils down to, yeah, first of all, as I said earlier, the constant time estimator somehow needs to capture the greatest common ancestor among the latest messages. But it also needs to capture all the forking points. And I don't mean like, yeah, I guess I mean forking points, but like if there's 3 validators, for example, you'll have 2 forking points at maximum. Or like if you have n validators, you have a maximum of n minus 1 forking points. And it's not enough. So one of my previous attempts, I tried to just keep track of all the forking points pairwise. And the issue there was that you not only have to keep track of the forking points pairwise, but also every combination wise. I don't know how to express that, but basically if you have a fork between A, B, and then that splits with C, and then later on A and B split, let's say, then you have to keep track of both where A and B split and also where A and B split with C. And
Got it. I understand.
Yep. So the tricky part is you can't just say A split with C at that point and B split with C at the point where you have to record it as A and B split with C. Otherwise, it's hard to, or otherwise you end up having to record, I guess, I think it's n factorial ways, but I'll have to double check that. But yeah, it blows up pretty quickly. So you just, yeah, like so yeah, you got to keep track of your n minus 1 points where the splits happen. And so the basic algorithm is, well, you take advantage of the fact that, let's say you have a DAG and you add 1 new block to it. When you add that new block, let's say you've already somehow so this is like a recursive algorithm. And so like assume that you've magically managed to record all the forking points. And you're about to add this new block. So when you add a new block, you know that the parent of that new block, which is already in the DAG, has the same forking points as the block that you just added, right? Because the only difference between, well, there's one adjustment to that, but the only difference between the parent block and the block that you just added is like that sort of additional edge. But otherwise, you can imagine if you like smash them together, then basically that new block is the same as the parent block. And like all the forking points between the parent and every other block in the DAG are the same. And so like the only difference between the block you just added and the parent is the fact that there is a forking point possibly between that block and the parent itself. It's not really a fork in the sense that there's only one possible direction, but you know that the parent stops at that point if it was created by a different validator. and the child goes sort of one above that. And so you can always, yeah, like when you're recursively building this thing, you can always say that the block that you're about to add, it has all the same forking points as the parent, and you add an extra line saying that the parent and the block you just currently added splits at the parent. And so yeah, that's basically the gist of the algorithm. And the only issue is you have to play the algorithm out for each validator, and so you end up having to sort of replay the DAG n times if there's n validators. And so I guess I'm not. I guess yeah. So at this point, I'm not sure. It memoizes the information of the splits, but it's debatable whether it's sort of worth the time, or if it saves that much time. Yeah.
Yeah, I understand. I think I understand the issue. You don't. Yeah. Hmm. I'm sorry. I have a whole bunch of thoughts all at once, which is why I'm being quiet. But there's a strong family resemblance between your memoization structure and a topological sort. Essentially, what you're trying to do is you're trying to provide a linear view of a DAG, and that the linear view is what you're using to give essentially a well ordering on what you're calling time, and yeah, I'm just wondering if you, because right now you have a lot of uncertainty about the algorithm, whether it works or not, and if you treat it as a topological sort, then that will give you some certainty about the properties that your algorithm establishes. Does that make sense?
I guess not really.
Do you know what a topological sort is?
Yeah, we have, or at least our, like the way we store the DAG right now is a topological sort, in the sense that yeah, we store the highest heights first, and then the next level, and then the third level, and then so on.
Yeah. But what I'm saying is you use the topological sort on the splits. So, right, so you're talking about a different. So how do I say this? The DAG is not necessarily a fork, right? The DAG represents just the fact that you've got some elements of information that are not ordered, whereas the splits represent, a difference in the view of the information. If I've understood you correctly, splitting is not splitting because you've got, essentially things that you can, that you're not required to order. The splitting happens when you have a disagreement on, which block is to be accepted. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's easy to keep track of all the splits, but the issue is there's n factorial splits. Like, I'm actually not sure if it's n factorial, but it's definitely a lot, right? Because it's not only that, like how to say it, the first validator can split with the second, and it can
So hang
also
on, before
split.
we go there, I just
Okay.
want to verify that I understand what you mean by split. So what is a split?
So it's any time that you have more than one child. Because it's
Any
an immutable structure, right? So once,
anytime a block has more than one child. In other words, multiple blocks point back to the same parent.
yep.
Okay,
So do you agree that,
so that's not what I was thinking a split was. So that's helpful. You're so for you a split is more it really is the DAG structure.
yes.
Okay, so let's walk through this again. What are you trying to measure? What is your, like before you were using flow as a measure of effectively time.
Yeah, so I think not, I, I feel like completely throwing away what I said before is the best strategy here.
Okay,
This has
all
nothing
right.
to do with flow or, yeah.
Okay,
It's
so
just, mhm. It's
what
just
are you
trying
trying
to
to measure?
oh, sorry. One more time, please.
What are you trying to measure? What does your algorithm compute?
I'm not trying to measure anything. I'm just trying to compute the old, like Vlad's latest message ghost algorithm that has been around for 2 years.
Yeah.
I want to do that quicker, basically.
Okay.
That's it. Yeah.
Okay. Now, is it imperative that we do that quicker? When we have something that works, do we need to do that more efficiently?
No, we don't.
Okay.
I mean, yeah.
So if we spend a couple of weeks on this and we don't have a solution, we could just go, well, I'll come back to this later, but because we've got a solution.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Okay.
We can do that.
I'm just trying to understand the nature of the work. That's all.
Yeah. Well, but I guess
Okay.
one thing is I do think it is our number one bottleneck, though. Like, we'll have a slow network, right?
I see. So you're saying that performance-wise, if we get this correct, we'll have a much higher transaction throughput.
Yes, or at least the consensus overhead will be much lower relative to the transaction throughput.
Okay, so that's a strong motivation to get this done.
Yep.
Okay, good. Now that's helpful. By the way, there's 10 minutes before developer stand up, so just letting everyone know.
But yeah, so we're just trying to mimic the output of latest message ghost. And so latest message ghost, it requires you to traverse the entire DAG every time you run it. And I guess the minor optimization is that you don't have to traverse the entire DAG, but only up till the greatest common ancestor of all latest messages. And that was what I was saying before or earlier in the stand-up. And so that's the best we got right now. So if the greatest common ancestor is the genesis block, then we have to traverse the entire DAG. So yeah, I guess. So yeah, as I said before, the way I'm trying to approach this constant time algorithm, or sorry, estimator, is to keep track of the n-1 forks that, or maximum of n-1 forks that happen. And yeah, like, well, if once you have those and you know which way, or like which validators are on which side of the fork, then it's really easy to compute the tip, or the output of the estimator from there. So, and I guess what I currently have, I believe works, but it requires each validator to replay all the blocks from their previous block's latest messages up to the current block's latest messages.
Is there a distinction between splits and forks?
So yeah, I guess I should clarify my language there. So in a DAG, there can be many splits, but there's only n-1 splits that matter. And so, yeah, I need to create
Where n is the
number of validators.
right.
Yeah. So there are, I believe, n factorial splits that don't matter, or up to that many. And then,
Yeah, it's only up to that many because you don't necessarily have that many messages in the system.
yeah, I need to come up with a tighter bound. But yeah, you can have a lot of splits, let's put it that way. But there's only n-1 splits that matter. Yeah. And we have to somehow record those n-1 splits, even though they can change pretty quickly once you start adding new latest messages. So like, yeah, and that's the tricky part. Like I don't think it's possible without having to replay some blocks every time a new block comes in.
I mean, it would seem that where you have a split, you don't have a fork. You have a partial ordering in that you may not the blocks may not be related and have no particular ordering, and trying to get a consensus on which order they're in is a losing game.
Well, we're just to be clear, we're not trying to get consensus here. We're just trying to calculate the output of the estimator, which will help us with consensus. Like this, I would treat this as a sub problem, let's say. Yeah.
Thank you. Can we talk
Okay.
about time for a minute?
Sure, go ahead.
Well, I mean, it intrigued me. And he said, you know, this introduces time. And I was saying that's sort of cool. I mean, there's entropy in the process. you in essence turn 2 ones and a 0 into 3 ones, and so you lose that. So you have time in that sense. It's but you also, when you get 3 ones, you send 3 ones. There's no entropy there, and yet that represents an ordering. And so relating that back to the sitter space and how that could be a spatial ordering rather than a temporal ordering or a local time ordering.
Yeah, I don't make a lot of distinctions between space and time anymore. I mean, maybe I should, but I don't think of them as effectively different. I think of them as integrated.
Local time is an ordering of events locally, and we each have different ordering of events locally, and that's our local time.
Sure.
Basically. And we have motion, where we skip, we change position in our space, which is distinct from well, a different perspective than then we're always at rest in our rest frame.
Sure. This is a longer conversation, and I've got to jump over to Dev stand-up, but
I mean,
we'll pick it up again soon.
Space and time are relative. I mean, we can't distinguish them absolutely, but
yeah,
they have that time is introduced locally.
Well, time is distinguished in a certain way because, like in the metric, it has a minus sign, whereas in the in the sort of in standard metrics, it has a minus sign, whereas
it's introduced by delay.
Yeah, something like that. I'm not sure I would think about it that way, but yeah, it is distinguished in a certain way. So maybe there is some utility there that I
All
should.
right, thank you much. Time to go.
All right, ciao.